Sap hissed in the iron pan as he tipped it slow, watching it darken, same way he watched everything now, careful, measured, alone. The cabin behind him stayed half empty by choice, a second chair pushed back from the table like it offended him. Hoofbeats didn't belong that far up the ridge. He ignored them until the horse wandered into his yard with a woman still seated, arguing with no one. She slid down, dusted her skirt, and knocked like she owned the place. "I'm your wife," she said, breathless. He didn't correct her, because this one didn't look like she planned on leaving. Before we ride deeper into the story, hit subscribe, ring the bell, so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The resin thickened as Silas Vance drew the iron pan off the coals, turning it with slow care so it wouldn't scorch. The scent rose sharp and sweet, clinging to the back of his throat. He worked by habit, the same motion, the same timing, like every other morning that had come before it. Nothing in his world changed unless he let it, and he had learned not to let much of anything in. Behind him, the cabin sat quiet. It was built to hold more than it did, but he kept it pared down, one plate, one cup, one chair set close to the fire. The other chair stayed tucked against the wall, out of the way, as if it had no purpose left. The horse came first, picking its way into the yard with the dull patience of an animal that had already gone farther than it wanted. Silas noticed it without looking up. Strange things wandered through the ridge sometimes. He didn't make a habit of asking why. Then the voice followed. It carried before the woman did, quick and breathless, arguing with the silence like it owed her an answer. When he finally turned, she was already sliding down from the saddle, boots hitting the dirt uneven, skirts catching on the stirrup. She steadied herself, dusted her hands, then looked straight at him as if she'd found what she'd been searching for all along. "I'm your wife," she said. Silas held her gaze, measuring her the way he measured everything, quiet, steady, without hurry. She wasn't what he expected, though he hadn't expected anything at all. Travel-worn, yes. Determined, more than that. There was something in the set of her shoulders that didn't match the miles on her boots. He didn't correct her. Instead, he set the pan aside and wiped his hands on a rag. "You're on the wrong ridge." "No," she said, stepping forward like the answer had already been decided. "I followed the directions exactly. Mountain, bend in the creek, broken cedar near the rise. This is the place." He glanced toward the tree line, then back at her. She stood her ground, most didn't. The wind shifted, carrying the edge of cold down from higher ground. Silas felt it settle in, the way it always did when the day was about to turn. "You should head back before the weather comes in," he said. She looked up at the sky, then back at him. "I've been heading somewhere for 3 days. I'm done heading." "I'm here." There was no tremble in her voice, only a quiet certainty that didn't belong on a stranger's porch. Silas studied her a moment longer, then turned back to the fire. If she stayed, she stayed. If she left, she left. It made no difference to him, except it did. He just didn't admit it. By the time the first flakes came down, the ridge had gone still. Snow didn't rush up there. It settled in slow, deliberate layers, covering tracks, softening edges, closing the world in. Eliza Crowell stood just inside the doorway, watching it fall like she'd never seen snow land so quietly. Her coat hung damp at the shoulders. Her boots left a thin trail of melt across the floor. Silas didn't comment. He handed her a folded blanket without looking at her, then moved back to his workbench, sharpening a blade that didn't need sharpening. "You don't talk much," she said after a while. "No." "That's all right," she continued, pulling the blanket around herself. "I talk enough for 2. He didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth almost shifted. Almost, she noticed. "You can laugh, you know," she added. "I can," he said. He didn't. The fire crackled between them, steady and familiar. Eliza moved closer to it, holding her hands out, her fingers reddened from the cold. "This place," she said softly, glancing around. "It's quiet." Silas set the blade down. "That's the point." She nodded, though something in her expression suggested she didn't quite understand. Or maybe she understood too well. "You live like no one else ever coming," she said. Silas didn't answer. He picked up the blade again, running the stone along its edge with the same careful rhythm. Eliza watched him a moment longer, then turned her attention to the kettle hanging above the fire. It rattled slightly, not enough to boil, just enough to make itself known. "Mind if I?" she asked. He shrugged once. She stepped in, adjusting the hook, adding a bit more water from a nearby jug. The movement was small, practical, useful. Silas noticed. He always noticed. The storm held them there longer than expected. 2 days turned into 3, then 4. The trail vanished beneath fresh snow, and the ridge became its own world, cut off from everything below. Eliza didn't sit idle. By the second morning, she'd found where he kept his supplies, though not without asking first. By the third, she'd rearranged them, not in a way that disrupted his order, but in a way that made things easier to reach. Silas didn't comment, but when he reached for a tool and found it exactly where his hand expected it to be, he paused. "You moved that," he said. "I improved it," she replied. He glanced at her. She didn't look away. He let it be. That was the first change. They settled into a rhythm neither of them named. He worked outside when the weather allowed, tapping trees, checking lines, hauling sap in careful loads. She followed at a distance at first, watching, asking questions he didn't always answer. Then she started helping. Not clumsily, as he'd expected, but with a quiet determination that surprised him. She learned how to carry without spilling, how to tie off a line, how to keep pace without slowing him down. "You're not from this kind of work," he said one afternoon, watching her steady a full bucket. "No," she admitted, "but I'm not afraid of it either." He considered that. Neither was he, once. Evenings changed first. She spoke, not constantly as before, but enough to fill the edges of the silence. Stories, small ones, about a boarding house with thin walls, about a neighbor who baked too much bread, about a town that never quite felt like home. Silas listened without meaning to. "You don't have to listen," she said one night when he hadn't said a word in a while. "I know." "But you are." He stared into the fire. "You talk like you expect someone to answer." She smiled faintly. "I talk like I hope they will." The fire popped, sending a small spark upward. Silas watched it fade. "I'm not much for talking," he said. "I noticed." There was no edge in her voice, just quiet acknowledgement. He found himself almost saying more. He didn't. The first time he laughed, it came without warning. She'd been trying to fix a loose hinge on the cupboard, her brow furrowed in concentration, tongue caught between her teeth. The hammer slipped, tapping her knuckle instead of the nail. She hissed under her breath, shook her hand, then looked at him as if daring him to comment. Silas huffed, a short, unexpected sound that surprised them both. Eliza blinked. Then she smiled, wide and unguarded. "There it is," she said. He shook his head, turning away, but the sound lingered. So did the feeling. When the storm finally broke, the ridge opened again. Tracks reappeared, faint at first, then clearer as the days warmed just enough to soften the snow. The path down the mountain returned, winding through the trees like it had never left. Eliza stood at the edge of it, her coat buttoned, her small bag packed. "You can make it down now," Silas said. "Yes." She didn't move. He waited. She looked back at the cabin, then at him. "You want me to go?" The question hung between them, heavier than it should have been. Silas considered his answer. This place had been his for a long time, quiet, controlled, untouched. Now it was. There were 2 cups by the fire, 2 sets of footsteps in the yard, a voice in the evenings that didn't belong to him but had somehow found a place there anyway. He looked at her, really looked this time. "You said you were my wife," he said. She nodded, uncertain. "You were wrong," he continued. Her shoulders shifted just slightly. He took a breath, steadying it. "But you're not unwelcome." It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd given anyone in a long time. Eliza held his gaze, searching for something in it. Whatever she found seemed to settle her. "I wasn't planning on leaving," she said softly. Silas exhaled, a slow release he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Then stay," he said. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a request. It was something else entirely. And for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like something he was guarding. It felt like something he was beginning to share. By the time the lower trail fully thawed, Eliza Crowell had already stopped moving through Silas Vance's cabin like a guest. She did not ask where the flour was kept anymore. She knew which shelf held the clean jars and which peg by the door carried the spare lantern. She had learned how much wood the stove liked before dawn and how long the bread ought to sit near the warm bricks without drying at the edges. None of it was done with a grand air or a claim over the place. She simply noticed what needed doing and did it. Silas told himself that was all it was. She was useful. Useful was not dangerous. Then spring began to prove him wrong. The first trip they made down to town together happened because Eliza announced she was going whether he approved or not. She had patched the knees of her only good skirt twice already, and the hem had finally given up in one long threadbare surrender. "I cannot keep pretending this is decent," she said that morning, holding the fabric out with a look of mild disgust. A determined goat could see through it. Silas, who had never once considered the proper measure of a skirt's decency, glanced up from trimming a length of bark and said, "There are no goats on this ridge." She narrowed her eyes at him. "That may be the poorest joke a man has ever made." "It was not a joke. That makes it worse." He looked down at his work again, but not before she caught the faint shift at the corner of his mouth. She had become too good at catching those. By noon they were on the trail, her on the bay mare that had brought her there, him walking beside his mule with a sack of resin cakes to sell. The town sat in the valley like a handful of weathered boards dropped beside the river, small, stubborn, and used to the business of other people. Silas usually came, traded, and left before anyone could draw him into talk. With Eliza beside him, that turned out to be impossible. Heads lifted when they entered the mercantile. Mrs. Bell, who ran the place with a tape measure around her neck and opinions sharp enough to cut leather, looked from Silas to Eliza and back again. "Well," she said, "so the mountain has finally decided to send down an explanation." Silas set his goods on the counter. "I came to trade." Mrs. Bell ignored him entirely and smiled at Eliza. "And you are?" "Eliza Crowell." Mrs. Bell's brows rose. "The bride." Eliza gave a small pause, then answered with the calm of a woman who had already survived embarrassment and had grown bored with it. "The one who stayed." Something in the store warmed at that. Mrs. Bell let out a quick sound that might have been a laugh and leaned both hands on the counter. "Well then," she said, "you're already half a legend." Silas busied himself untying the sack, but he could feel the turn in the room. Men who used to nod at him from a distance now looked at Eliza with open curiosity. Women who had likely heard half the county's worth of stories about him softened when she smiled back at them. He had lived above that town for years without belonging to it. Eliza stepped into it once and somehow made it feel less far away. She did more than buy cloth that day. Mrs. Bell, discovering that Eliza had neat handwriting and a quick head for sums, asked whether she might come in twice a week to help with the order book and receipts. The schoolteacher, Miss Avery, spoke to her near the pickle barrels and mentioned that the church social needed someone willing to organize donated blankets before winter. By the time they left, Eliza had somehow gathered an invitation to tea, a promise of part-time work, and 2 women asking when she would next be down the mountain. Silas carried the parcels to the wagon in silence. When they started back up the trail, Eliza rested her hands on the saddle horn and looked down at him. "You appear troubled." "I am not troubled." You look the way a man looks when he bites into a biscuit and finds out it's sweet. Silas glanced up. That sounds like trouble. For some men, perhaps. He walked a few more paces. Mrs. Bell pays badly. Eliza blinked, then smiled, slow and pleased. So you were listening. It was a store, hard not to. But you noticed she pays badly. She undermeasured your cloth too. Eliza laughed then, full and genuine, and the sound drifted up through the pines ahead of them. Silas said nothing after that, but he found himself glad he had gone. From then on, the valley stopped being only a place to trade. It became a place where Eliza belonged. Twice a week she went down to help at the mercantile, and once people discovered she had a gift for putting things in order, they found reasons to ask more of her. She wrote letters for an old ranch wife whose eyes had gone weak. She straightened the church pantry. She helped Miss Avery mend a stack of readers so the children wouldn't have to share 3 to a desk. No one had to make room for her. She made her own. Silas watched that happen with a strange mixture of pride and unease. It was pride because she had done it honestly. No coquetry, no fishing for sympathy, no leaning on him to explain her. She carried herself into each place with that same stubborn steadiness she had first brought to his yard. It was unease because every new root she put down made it easier to imagine she might one day pull them up and leave a clean hole behind. He did not like how often that thought came to him. He liked even less what followed it. One evening, he came back from the sugar stand with a split in his glove and found the cabin bright with lamplight. Eliza sat at the table bent over Mrs. Bell's ledger, lips moving silently as she checked figures. Her hair had slipped loose from its pins. A curl rested against her cheek. Without thinking, Silas stopped in the doorway and simply looked. The cabin had once been a place of sharp corners and necessary objects. Now a blue cup sat on the shelf beside his tin one. A bowl of drying herbs hung near the window. One of Eliza's shawls rested over the back of the second chair, the chair he had not used in years and had once pretended not to see. She felt his gaze and lifted her head. "You're late." Water ran high near the lower stand. She studied him a moment. "You're blading." He glanced at his hand. The split in the glove had opened his knuckle against the rough bark, leaving a dark line down his wrist. "It's nothing." "That usually means it needs tending." Before he could object, she was on her feet. She fetched the basin, poured in warm water from the kettle, and set it on the table. He should have said no. He should have washed and bound it himself as he always had. Instead, perhaps because she was already there, perhaps because the room felt too steady to disturb, he sat. Eliza took his hand with a gentleness that unsettled him more than pain. Her fingers were warm. She washed away the blood in small, careful strokes, her face bent close in concentration. Neither of them spoke. The silence changed shape. He became aware of things he had ignored before: the soft scrape of her sleeve against the table edge, the clean scent of soap, the pale line where lamplight touched the curve of her throat. She looked up once, perhaps to ask whether the cut strung, and found him watching her. For a moment, both of them held still. Her hand remained around his. His breath caught, not in fear, not exactly, but in something more dangerous, because it asked for nothing and still had power over him. Then Eliza released him and reached for the cloth bandage. "There," she said, too evenly, "try not to fight trees tomorrow." Silas stood so quickly the chair legs scraped. "I've done worse." "I believe that." He moved to the stove, though he had no reason to. Behind him, he could feel her own composure returning piece by piece. The room that had seemed smaller a moment before felt suddenly too close. That night he lay awake listening to the cabin settle around them and hated how sharply he remembered the warmth of her hand. After that, he grew watchful in ways he could not explain. He noticed when she looked tired before she admitted it. He noticed which days she came back from town animated and which days quieter, as though someone's sorrow had caught on her and come home. He noticed that she favored plum jam over honey, that she hummed when mending, that she always paused at the top of the ridge to look west before going inside, as if she meant to thank the evening for arriving. He did not mean to collect such things. They simply stayed, and with them came the trouble. His old friend Caleb Mercer found him knee-deep in creek water one morning, setting stones to guide the runoff around the lower tap line. Caleb was one of the few men who made the climb without invitation, and one of the fewer still whom sealers did not turn away. He was broad-shouldered, sun-browned, and blessed with the kind of patient humor that could survive another man's silence. Caleb dismounted, took in the new drainage line, and then took in sealers himself. "You've moved that whole bank." "It needed doing." "Might have. Still, you usually let a thing annoy you 3 seasons before deciding it deserves effort." Sealers did not answer. Caleb stepped down into the mud beside him. "Saw Miss Crowell in town yesterday." At once Sealers's hands slowed on the rock he was placing. "She was sorting cloth with Mrs. Bell," Caleb went on mildly. "Whole place looked brighter for having her in it." Sealers set the stone. "Town always did like novelty." Caleb gave him a look. "That what you call it?" Sealers straightened. "What did you come up here for?" "To trade traps." Caleb paused, "and to see whether the stories are true." Sealers's jaw tightened. "What stories?" "That you speak in whole sentences now. That you came to the social and stood 10 minutes without looking like you'd rather face wolves. That when Miss Crowell laughs, you listen." Sealers turned back to the water. "People talk too much. Usually because there's something to talk about." The creek slid cold around their boots. Somewhere above them, a jay barked from the trees. Caleb's voice softened. "You don't have to answer me, but don't lie to yourself. That's harder to live with." After Caleb rode off, Sealers remained by the creek longer than the work required. He knew what his friend had seen because he had seen it too. The problem was not that Eliza had changed his days. It was that some stubborn part of him had begun to welcome the change, and welcoming it felt too close to betrayal. He had loved once, not with show, not with easy words, but with the whole of himself. He had buried that life with his wife, Mara, beneath a patch of high ground where wild asters came in late summer. Since then he had kept moving the way some men keep breathing after a wound, because stopping would mean acknowledging what had been taken. Now a woman with a determined chin and ink-smudged fingers had entered that stillness and made him notice the empty places again. He did not know whether to thank her for it or fear her. The answer came, as such answers often do, in a small ordinary moment made sharp by accident. A week later, Eliza insisted on helping bring in the first heavy casks from the upper shed. The morning had turned slick after a night rain. The boards at the threshold held a sheen like glass. Sealers had just lifted one end of the cask when Eliza, carrying a bundle of wrapped tools, stepped backward to clear space and lost her footing. He moved before thought. One hand caught her at the waist, the other braced against the doorframe. The tools clattered around their feet. Eliza's breath left her in a startled sound, and suddenly she was held against him from shoulder to knee, light and solid at once. Rain dripped from the eaves. Somewhere water ticked into a bucket. Neither of them let go. She looked up first. There was no jest in her face then, no easy remark to rescue them. Only surprise and something quieter that made his chest draw tight. Sealers felt the warmth of her through the damp cloth of her dress. He felt, too, the terrible ease with which holding her seemed right, so he released her too quickly. Eliza steadied herself, gathering the fallen tools with hands that were not entirely steady. "Thank you," she said. He picked up the cask. "Watch your step." The words came out harsher than he intended. The hurt in her eyes was brief, but he saw it. She covered it at once, the way proud people do, by becoming very efficient. That evening she spoke little, he spoke less. The silence between them was no longer the old kind. 2 nights later, he found her outside after supper sitting on the chopping block with her shawl around her shoulders. The air smelled of wet pine and turned earth. Far off, the river carried spring melt in a low, steady rush. "You'll catch cold," he said. "I won't." He might have gone back inside. Instead, he stayed standing near the woodpile. After a while, she said, "Did I offend you?" The question struck him cleanly because it was asked without accusation. Only weariness. "No. You've been somewhere else these last few days, and unless that somewhere else has better manners than this ridge, I suspect it has to do with me." Silas stared out into the dark timber. Honesty rose to his throat and stopped there. "I'm not used to," he broke off. "To what?" He almost said to warmth, to wanting, to the sound of another person moving in the next room and not wishing it gone. Instead he said, "Chain." Eliza drew the shawl closer. "Neither am I." That brought his eyes to her. She was looking straight ahead, not at him. "I spent a long time learning how to make myself useful," she said. "It is easier than hoping to be wanted." Something in him gave at that, not all at once, not enough to mend, but enough to hurt. He sat down on the overturned bucket a few feet away. The moon had not risen. The dark let a person say things daylight would question. "She died in winter," he said. Eliza did not move. "My wife." The words felt old and sharp from disuse. Fever took hold fast. By the time the doctor made the climb, she was already beyond hearing him. Afterward, everyone meant well. "They came with food, with talk, with hands on my shoulder. I wanted them all gone." He swallowed. "So I made sure they stayed gone." The night remained still around them. When he finally looked at Eliza, her eyes shone in the faint light, but she had not interrupted him once. "I kept the place the same," he said. "Thought if I changed nothing, then maybe I wouldn't be leaving her behind." His voice had gone rough. He hated that, but not enough to stop. "And then you came up that trail arguing with the air like it had cheated you somehow." A breath that almost became a laugh broke against his chest and failed there, and everything started changing anyway. Eliza turned toward him then, slowly, giving him time to retreat if he meant to. He didn't. "You are not leaving her behind," she said. "You are only still here." The simple kindness of it undid him. Silas bent forward, elbows on his knees, and covered his eyes with one hand. The grief did not arrive like a storm. It came the way deep water seeps through old boards, quiet, persistent, impossible to hold back once it finds a way in. His shoulders shook once, then again. He had stood at a grave without tears. He had split wood through winters that would have broken weaker men. He had taught himself how not to look at the second chair, the second cup, the second side of the bed. But one gentle sentence in the dark, and the whole hard structure of him gave way. Eliza did not crowd him. She did not offer bright comfort or tell him the pain had passed. She simply moved closer and set her hand between his shoulders, warm and steady, as if to say he did not have to carry it alone for this one moment. When he could breathe cleanly again, he straightened and wiped a hand across his face, ashamed and strangely lighter. "I'm sorry," he said, "for grieving." Her voice held no pity, only quiet certainty. "I should hope not." He gave a ragged exhale. "You make it hard to stay the man I was." "Perhaps," she said, and now there was the gentlest hint of that familiar spirit again. "That is because the man you were is tired." Silas looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not an interruption, not a burden, not even merely a kindness. He saw the woman who had stepped into his broken quiet and refused to be frightened by it. The woman who had made a place for herself without asking permission. The woman whose presence no longer felt like intrusion, but like warmth returning to cold hands. He did not know what would come of that. He only knew he could no longer pretend it meant nothing. So they sat there while the night held around them, his grief named at last, her hands still resting lightly against his back, and the old life behind him no longer the only life he could imagine. For several days after that night by the woodpile, nothing between them was spoken plainly. Yet everything had changed. Silas Vance rose before dawn as he always had, fed the fire, checked the sap lines, and moved through the dark cabin with the old economy of motion that had once made his life feel manageable. But now each act seemed to carry an awareness it had not carried before. He knew when Eliza stirred in the small room off the kitchen. He knew the difference between the soft tread of her feet when she had slept well and the slower, quieter pace that meant her thoughts had kept her awake. He knew when she paused in the doorway to watch the first wash of grey reach the ridge, and he knew, without turning, when she chose to leave him to the silence. That last part was what made it difficult. Eliza Crowell, who had once filled his cabin with steady questions and mild arguments and observations about everything from weather to crooked shelves, had grown careful. She was not cold. She was not offended. If anything, she seemed gentler with him than before. But she had begun to give him room in a way that made the room itself feel too large. At breakfast, she spoke only when needed. In town, she let him walk a half step ahead if that was where he placed himself. In the evenings, she mended by the lamp or balanced Mrs. Bell's accounts and did not try to pull him into talk unless he started it first. Silas understood the kindness of it. That was the trouble. She had seen him undone. She had sat beside his grief and neither fled from it nor demanded anything of him afterward. She was giving him dignity, and he found it harder to bear than questions. 3 times he nearly said something worth saying. The first was by the lower sugar shed, when he came upon her struggling with a warped door that had swollen after a cold rain. Stepped in without a word, shoulder to the frame, while she pulled the latch clear. The door gave all at once. She stumbled backward against him, and for a breath they were pressed close in the scent of damp wood and smoke and spring earth. Eliza looked up quickly, surprise widening her eyes, but Silas only steadied her and stepped away. The words had risen then, simple enough, "Stay where I can see you," or "I am trying," or even "Thank you for that night." Instead he said, "This hinge needs replacing." The hurt did not return to her face. That was worse. She only nodded and fetched the hammer. The second time was on a warm afternoon in town, when Mrs. Bell waved Eliza behind the counter to settle a disagreement over coffee tins, while Silas stood near the porch post with Caleb Mercer. He watched Eliza calm 2 stubborn ranch wives with a firmness so polite it left them no room to be insulted. She measured cloth with one hand, totaled figures with the other, and still found time to smile at Miss Avery's schoolchildren when they crowded in after slates. Caleb followed his gaze. "You've been staring for a full minute," he said. "I have not." "Then perhaps your eyes got lost." Silas would have ignored him, but Caleb shifted his shoulder against the post and spoke in the tone he reserved for truth a man could dodge only so long. "You've already crossed the hard part." Silas frowned, meaning, "You let her matter." Silas looked away toward the hitching rail, where a grey gelding was worrying its bit. "That is not something a man decides." "No," Caleb agreed. "But saying it out loud is." Silas gave him a flat look. "You're enjoying this." "Some." Silas snorted despite himself. Caleb's grin faded into something steadier. "You think if you reach for what's in front of you, you'll be robbing the dead. That's not how love works, Silas. It doesn't divide into neat piles to keep one woman from another. It grows where it's tended, or it dies where it's starved." Silas did not answer, but the words stayed with him long after the trip home, and when he looked across the wagon seat and saw Eliza asleep against a sack of flour, bonnet tilted low, one hand still curled around a spool of ribbon she had forgotten to put away, he felt those words settle deeper than he liked. The third time came closest. It was late. The valley lay under a clear, cold moon, and the cabin windows shone softly against the dark. Eliza stood at the kitchen table trimming wick ends and setting the good lamp to rights. Sealers had just come in from banked coals and found the sight of her there so rooted, so natural in his home, that the years before her seemed suddenly thin and airless. He crossed to the shelf, set down his gloves, and said, "Eliza." She looked up at once. Yes. He should have continued. He should have taken the one step left between silence and honesty. Instead, he saw, with the force of a blow, Mara's shawl folded in the cedar chest by the bed. He remembered his wife laughing once over burned biscuits, flour on her cheek, sunlight in her hair, not as accusation, not as command, only memory. Still, it struck him with enough guilt that the words dried in his throat. Eliza waited 1 second too long before returning to the lamp. "Did you need something?" Sealers stared at the table, at her careful hands, and said, "No." She nodded, "All right." That night he slept badly and woke angry with himself. Eliza, for her part, did not press, but there was a gravity to her now, a held breath beneath her usual warmth. She had offered him steadiness after grief. She would not humiliate herself by asking for an answer he had not chosen to give. So the days gathered tension in small ways. His chair edged closer to hers by the fire because he moved it there without thinking. Her shawl remained draped over the second chair, and he never once shifted it aside. He began bringing back small things from town without comment: a packet of lemon drops from Mrs. Bell's shelf, a better pair of work gloves, a length of blue thread because he had noticed she used it more than white. Eliza always thanked him with a quietness that carried more feeling than any bright fuss would have. Once, when she found the lemon drops near her plate, she touched the paper twist and said, "You remember everything, don't you?" Sealers looked at his coffee. "Not everything." Her answer came soft, "Only the things that matter." He could not meet her eyes after that. The turning point arrived not in some grand crisis, but through the possibility of ordinary loss. In early June, Mrs. Bell received a letter from her sister in Helena asking after reliable help for a larger mercantile there, better wages, better rooms, a livelier town. Mrs. Bell mentioned it over a barrel of beans while Eliza was balancing accounts. Sealers happened to be in the doorway with a coil of rope over one shoulder. "It may suit you," Mrs. Bell said. "You've a gift for keeping disorder from breeding." Eliza smiled politely. "That is one way to describe it. I could write on your behalf by Sunday." Sealers stood so still that even Mrs. Bell noticed. Eliza, perhaps sensing that stillness without looking at him, said only, "That is kind of you, let me think on it." He said nothing then. He helped load the wagon, drove her home, and spent the entire climb telling himself it made no difference. Helena was a fine place, safer than the Ridge. Better prospects, company, a church with regular services, streets that did not vanish under snow for weeks at a time. She would be wanted there. The thought should have satisfied him. Instead, it hollowed him out. That evening, Eliza went about supper with unusual care, as though she could feel the question lying between them and was not ready to pick it up. Sealers split kindling after dusk, though none was needed. He walked the yard twice. Checked the mules laid. Stood at the edge of the ridge looking down at a valley already going blue with evening. When he came back in, Eliza was folding the dishcloth. "Mrs. Bell means well," she said without turning. Sealers rested a hand on the doorframe. "Yes. I have not decided anything." He heard the invitation in that, or perhaps the plea not to make her speak alone. Still, he said, it would be a good offer. Her hands stilled on the cloth. She turned then, face composed in the way it became when she was bracing herself. "Yes," she said, "it would." Nothing more followed. That silence did what no argument could have done. It made plain to Sealers how badly he had failed. She had given him loyalty, work, laughter, compassion, and all the patience a man had any right to ask. And when faced with the chance she might go, He had answered like a stranger granting sensible advice. He did not touch supper. Eliza noticed and did not mention it. The next morning she left early for town, saying she had ledger work to finish before Mrs. Bell opened. Silas watched her ride down the trail with the sunrise at her back and knew, with a certainty deeper than reason, that if he let another day pass in silence he would lose her, not because Helena would take her, because she would finally believe he wanted nothing enough to keep it. He worked badly all morning, spilled sap, miscounted barrels, left a tool in the rain. By noon he had had enough of his own cowardice. He washed at the basin, changed his shirt, and rode for town. The valley was busy with Saturday trade. Wagons lined the street. Children wove between skirts and boots. A fiddler outside the barber shop was sawing through a tune no one had asked for. Silas tied his horse hard enough at the rail that the blacksmith looked up from his forge. Everything all right up there. The man called. No, Silas said, and kept walking. He found Eliza at the church hall with Miss Avery and 3 widow women sorting blankets for a late-season charity drive. She stood on a stool reaching for a stack from the top shelf, sleeves rolled, loose strands of hair escaping her pins in the heat. She laughed at something old Mrs. Pritchard said, and the sound struck him with such force that he stopped in the doorway like a man hit by weather. Eliza turned at the hush that followed. When she saw him, her smile faded into alert uncertainty. Silas. Miss Avery glanced from one to the other, and with the swift perception of women who had lived among people too long to miss what mattered, said, Mrs. Pritchard, I believe we were needed outside. Within moments the hall was theirs, though the widow women did not depart so quickly as to miss the beginning. Silas stepped inside. For once, he did not know where to put his hands. His hat remained in one, turning slowly against his thigh. I should have spoken last night, he said. Eliza came down from the stool. You often should. There was no malice in it, but the truth of it nearly undid him. He nodded once. Yes. She waited. From the open windows came the sounds of town life, wagon wheels, a dog barking, the fiddler finding the same sour note again, all the ordinary noise of a world continuing, heedless and wide. Silas felt as if he stood in the smallest room he had ever known. I told you change was hard for me, he said. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Eliza did not move. Her hands rested together in front of her still, as though she feared encouraging him too soon might send him back into silence. The whole truth is that I have been afraid from the start. He swallowed, afraid of wanting what I had no right to want, afraid of what it would mean if this. He glanced around helplessly, then looked straight at her. If you became necessary to me. Her expression softened, but she did not rescue him, so he went on. When you came to my yard, I thought you were one more trouble I'd endure until weather or sense sent you away. Then the weather cleared, and your sense never did improve. A small, rough smile touched his mouth. You stayed. You put order where there had only been habit. You filled the house without crowding it. You made people in town speak to me like I still belonged among them. You made me laugh at things I had forgotten were funny. Eliza's breath caught, faint as a thread pulled tight. Silas stepped closer. And when you sat with me that night outside, when I spoke Mara's name and you did not flinch from it, you gave me something no one else had, not permission to forget, permission to keep living. Her eyes were bright now, but steady. He drew one more breath. It felt like the deepest he had taken in years. I loved my wife, he said. I will not lie about that. I thought if I opened any door in my heart after her, I would be dishonoring what we had. But holding shut every door has not honored anyone. It has only kept me cold. His voice grew rougher, not from tears this time, but from honesty finally used. I am frightened still, frightened that joy can be taken, frightened that loving again makes a man vulnerable in all the worst ways. But I love you, Eliza. I love you in the mornings when you scold the stove for burning too hot, and in town when you take over a room without ever asking leave, and in the evenings when your voice makes the cabin feel like a home instead of a shelter. I love the way you stayed. And I cannot stand the thought of this place or my life without you in it." Silence held after that, full and tremulous. Eliza lowered her gaze for just a moment, perhaps to gather herself. When she lifted it again, what he saw there was not surprise. It was relief so deep it had been waiting a long time. "You should have spoken last night," she said softly. He let out a breath that shook into something almost like a laugh. "I know." She stepped toward him. "For the record, Helena sounds dreary." He blinked. "Does it?" Terribly, a faint smile touched her mouth. "Not enough pine trees, far too many men with polished boots." "Then stay away from it." "That depends." She drew close enough that the space between them became a decision. "Are you asking as the man who once tolerated me, or the man who has finally had the good sense to admit he loves me?" Sealers who could split timber in a blizzard and set a broken axle by lantern light found his answer caught in his throat like a younger fool. "The second," he said at last. "Good." She reached up then, not dramatically, only surely, and rested her hand against his jaw. "Because I love you too, Silas Vance. Not for becoming easy, you never will be. Not because your home needed me. It did, but that isn't the same thing. I love you because you are kind in all the places that matter, even when you are clumsy with words. I love that you notice what goes unspoken. I love that you carry grief honestly instead of hiding from it. And I love that beneath all your caution, you keep choosing to show up." Something in his face must have broken open then, because her thumb brushed once against his cheek as if she were steadying not him, but the moment itself. When he kissed her, it was with all the care he gave to things he meant to keep. No urgency, no grand claim. Only both hands rising to her waist, her fingers curling lightly at his shoulders, and a tenderness that felt less like conquest than arrival. The hall, the town, the sounds from the street, all of it fell away beneath the simple fact of her mouth answering his. When they parted, neither moved far. Miss Avery, who had likely been lingering outside for exactly this purpose, let out a pointed cough from beyond the door. Eliza laughed softly into Silas's chest. "We have an audience," she murmured. "Let them wait." But they did not wait forever. Towns have a way of folding joy quickly into themselves, and by evening, the valley knew that the mountain man had at last made sense. "Mrs." Belle pretended irritation and sent up a bolt of cream muslin, because a wedding deserves better than practical brown. Caleb clapped Silas hard enough on the back to earn a glare and a grin in the same moment. Old Mrs. Pritchard announced she had known it all along, though no one could say what precisely she had known or when. The wedding itself was held 6 weeks later in the meadow below the ridge, where late summer clover ran thick and bees worked lazily through the heat. Eliza wore the cream muslin, modestly made but fine in the morning light. Silas stood waiting in a dark coat Caleb had insisted he borrow, looking like a man both deeply uncomfortable with public attention and willing to endure it for exactly one reason. When Eliza reached him, her hand slipped into his with such natural certainty that the gathered townsfolk softened at once. The preacher said the needed words. Silas answered them in a voice low but unwavering. Eliza answered clearly enough for the birds in the cottonwoods to hear, and when it was done, he kissed her with less reserve than in the church hall, but no less sincerity, and the valley seemed, for once, precisely right. Marriage did not transform either of them into other people. It made them more fully themselves together. Autumn found the cabin altered in ways both small and complete. The second chair was no longer merely used, it was claimed, with Eliza's shawl over it and a basket of mending beside it. The shelf by the stove held jars of preserves in careful rows, each labeled in her neat hand. Silas built a longer table, muttering that the old one was too narrow for ledgers and meals both, though they both knew no ledger required that much room. He added a porch bench where there had once been only a chopping block. Eliza planted sage and onions near the kitchen wall. He repaired the roof before the first snow without waiting 3 seasons to decide it deserved effort. In winter, they learned the pleasures of shared weather. She read aloud on storm nights while he carved handles or patched harness. He brought in fir boughs at Christmas because she said a house ought to smell alive in the darkest month. She burned the biscuits once, and he laughed before she did. In spring, they argued amiably over whether chicks ought to be kept in the shed or the kitchen for the first week. She won for 3 days. He won thereafter, though not without bribing her with lemon drops. Years moved the way good years do, not without sorrow, not without labor, but with enough steady affection beneath them to make both bearable. The cabin gained a pantry, then a garden fence, then a small room added at the back. People came up the ridge more often, sometimes for resin, sometimes for advice, sometimes just because Eliza made coffee strong and conversation easy. Silas never became a social man, but he ceased being an absent one. He stood as godfather to one of Miss Avery's nieces. He helped Caleb raise a barn. He laughed more, though always unexpectedly, as if the sound still surprised him on its way out. And in the 3rd year of their marriage, in the first green softness after thaw, Eliza placed Silas's hand against the curve beneath her apron and watched understanding rise in his face, slow as sunrise over snow. For a long moment he did not speak. His palm stayed there, trembling once. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. She smiled. "Unless Mrs. Bell has begun stocking cabbages under my ribs, yes." He let out a startled breath that turned to wonder. Then he dropped to one knee in front of her, as if the moment required reverence, wrapped his arms carefully around her, and pressed his forehead to her middle. Eliza laid both hands in his hair and closed her eyes. Their daughter arrived in early winter, red-faced and furious at the cold, with Eliza's determined mouth and Silas's dark eyes. They named her Mara Jane, not as a shadow laid over the child, but as a thread joining love to love without fear. Eliza was the one who suggested it. Silas could not answer at first. He only kissed her hand, and then the tiny brow of the sleeping baby, and sat a long time, looking as though some final locked room inside him had opened to light. On certain mornings, years later, the house on the ridge could be seen from the lower trail, with smoke lifting blue from the chimney and laughter escaping every time the door opened. A little girl ran the yard with a wooden spoon for a scepter. Her mother called after her from the porch, half stern and half smiling. Her father stood by the sugar pan, no less careful than he had always been, but not alone. There were 2 cups on the table now, and sometimes 3. There were mittens drying by the stove and notes pinned by the door, and a second chair worn smooth with daily use. Travelers who passed that way heard different versions of how it all began. Some said a mail-order bride had taken the wrong trail. Some said a mountain man had finally been matched by someone too stubborn to frighten. Mrs. Bell said the woman saved him. Caleb said they saved each other. Eliza, if asked, only smiled and said she had been tired of heading somewhere and decided to arrive. Silas never offered a version of his own. He did not need to. It was there in the way he looked at his wife when she crossed the room. In the way he lifted his daughter to sit on the porch rail and taught her how to watch the weather. In the way the old silence of the cabin had been replaced not by noise but by life. The past was not erased. It was carried honestly, given its place, and set beside all that came after. And because of that, the home on the ridge did not feel haunted by what had been lost. It felt blessed by what had endured and by what, against all expectation, had been given again. So when evening settled over the timber and the lamps were lit against the cold, the man who had once arranged his whole life around absence sat at his own table with love on either side of him. The second chair was no longer an offense. The house no longer waited empty around him. And the heart he had once kept shut in grief beat now in a home made warm by choice, by courage, and by the stubborn woman who had climbed the wrong ridge and refused to leave. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help this old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matter. So, till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.